Hi gay! I guess I should address the elephant in the room. I got my hair done. I figured what better way to introduce the world to my drag persona than my Pride Month reading wrap-up video. This is the person that I've always kind of wanted to host this show. I have been kind of practicing my makeup. I know it doesn't look like I've been practicing, but I assure you I have. Not quite there yet, but I'm teaching myself, so give me a little bit of slack. Turns out you need a lot of shit and a lot of expenses to turn out a full Queen of Hell fantasy. But I'm here, I'm super fucking queer, and let's talk about some queer horror for Pride Month. So I'm not gonna beat around the bush. Anti-queer sentiment and this sentiment is as high as it has ever been in my lifetime. I guess my message to all the queers out there is I hope you are safe. I hope you are in an environment where you're able to be yourself. I will always be supportive of all of the freaks and outcasts of the world. That's what the horror community should be about. And as to my knowledge, the only cross-dress-in extreme horror booktuber, please let me know if there's another one. Regardless of how small my following is, I do want to be that source of pride and acceptance for the queer community, especially us queer horror lovers. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the books that I read for Pride Month. Today I'm going to be telling you about 3 queer horror books. One centers around gay men, one centers around a trans woman, and one centers around lesbians. I'm very excited to talk about these 3 books today, so let's get into it. First, I want to talk about a new release in the United States this year, but did have a previous publication in the UK in 2021, Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. This is a ghost story that is about fascism and the trans experience, and to be completely honest, I was a little concerned going into this that it would not be my thing. First of all, ghost stories typically are not my #1 choice of horror. Secondly, this is published by Tor Nightfire, and I have read some really good stuff from them, but a lot of stuff that purports to be horror and ends up not being horror. For instance, Katrina Ward, she's my go-to example of a thriller writer that I believe is sort of being mismarketed as horror. But I digress. The third reason was this cover looks a bit YA to me, and I needn't have worried. This is fabulous literary horror. You can see Shirley Jackson in the background for sure. There are actually some clever paraphrases of lines in The Haunting of Hill House in this book, so it's very clear who Alison Rumfitt sort of idolizes in the horror genre. It's very difficult to describe the plot of this book because it's actually written in a stream of consciousness kind of style. This is a much more literary and challenging book than I would have ever expected. But essentially, it takes place in the United Kingdom, and it is very tied in with the political climate over there right now. It follows 2 or kind of 3 primary characters. The first of which is Alice, a trans woman, and her former best friend, who is now her mortal enemy, Isla, who has kind of gone over to the TERF's side. So there's this vitriolic relationship between the two. The story almost emerges from a fog throughout the book. I don't think this is a spoiler because it becomes apparent pretty early on in the book to my recollection. Both of these characters have a shared traumatic history in this house. And the house, called Albion, is the third character. People talk often about haunted houses in Gothic horror being characters in and of themselves, and this takes it to quite a literal extreme of that. The house has a voice. It gets into the heads of the characters. They hear the house's voice, and you can't quite tell if it's actually the house or if it's their internal voices that the house is giving shape to. I loved that aspect of it. There's a lot of sort of questioning reality in this book. It becomes clear that Isla and Alice have different accounts of what happened in that house. and both of them claim to be the victim of a horrible act that the other put them through. And the way those two stories are resolved at the end, I will say, is a jaw-dropping moment in this book for me that played with form in a way that I could see maybe somebody finding a bit gimmicky or pretentious, but I thought it perfectly wove together the themes of the book and the narrative that we've been told. It's just dynamite, especially for this being a debut novel, and its understanding of fascism as something that comes from an internal feeling of insecurity or being threatened is something that just rang so true to what I'm seeing happen with my community right now, where people are afraid, and they're rightfully afraid, but that fear is misdirected to a vulnerable group. And that's kind of what I think the foundation of the TERF movement is about. Righteous fear and anger at the patriarchy misdirected towards some of the people who are the most vulnerable under it. And I think that this book explored that so well, and not in a preachy way. It is punk and metal as hell. The characters in this are not saints. It discusses things like drug use and fetishes very candidly. I felt I was reading something that was too personal, even though it's a fictional character. I mean, there's clearly a lot of Alison Rumfit in the character of Alice. The horror is surreal and beautifully done, grotesque at times. There's body horror, there is torture, there's just every amount of like it's a very all-encompassing horror story, which I really loved. Even though it's a ghost story, it is hardcore horror, and I just loved it. I thought the ending was horribly believable and so devastating. Tell Me I'm Worthless is the real deal. This is fantastic queer horror that I think should go down as momentous and important to the genre. I loved this book, and I cannot wait for Alison Rumfit's next book, Brainworms, which promises to be a body horror extravaganza. Sign me the fuck up. And then I read the sapphic horror novella that's been on everyone's lips since it first came out, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca. You'll know if you've been a faithful watcher of my videos that Eric LaRocca has not tended to be for me. There's one book of his that I absolutely loved, and that was We Can Never Leave This Place. The other two either just didn't work for me or I thought were flat out abysmal. And I'm sorry to say that I am going to join the hate train on Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke. Hate train might be a little too strong of a word. I don't know that I hated it. I think Eric LaRocca is very good at writing stuff that is entertaining in the moment, but it falls apart under the tiniest bit of scrutiny. It is a very brief novella that's told in a series of instant messages. It takes place in the early 2000s. It begins with this young lesbian woman posting an ad on a queer chat room that she's selling an antique apple peeler that has a vibrant history, including that it is supposed to have been owned by Charles Ives at one point, and she gets some interest. This relationship unfolds through direct messaging. We gradually learn sort of the backstory of one of these characters. The other one kind of remains shrouded in mystery, and you kind of wonder if this person is who they say they are. I'll leave it there because what their relationship evolves or devolves into is kind of the crux of the narrative, and it is a very short novella. I read it in one sitting in an hour, which is what most people have said about it, and I will give it this: it's an engaging read from beginning to end. So engaging, in fact, that I think it's way too short. Like, twice as short as it should be. And the reason for that is because it completely falls apart in terms of believability. The individual leaps in logic are just too wide for me. The evolution of these characters' relationship is just so awkwardly paced and unbelievable, frankly. Stylistically, it bothered me as well. Eric LaRocca loves purple prose, loves to write poetically. I don't think that this is the kind of narrative where that really shines. If I'm reading a chat room-based book, I'm expecting to read something where people talk as if they would in a chat room setting. I think it should be conversational, not so much poetic, but there are passages where it's almost like Eric LaRocca forgets the framing device of his own book and will go off on these monologuing paragraphs about their life story and their emotions and what they were feeling when they did this thing. Completely wrenches me out of the experience because I no longer believe that this is something that someone is typing to someone else on the computer. It also kind of just reinforces stereotypes rather than playing with them in an interesting way. Eric LaRocca has been outspoken in response to people who criticize their books for their queer representation, and generally goes with the argument of, I think queer people should be allowed to be monsters in books, which I agree with wholeheartedly, and we'll get into that in the next book that I talk about. But I'm sort of seeing a trend with this and one of the stories in They Were Here Before Us of regurgitating tropes and stereotypes, and harmful ones at that, and not really doing anything with them, not commenting on them, just regurgitating them and presenting them as is. And there's just not as much depth to their work as I think a lot of people are seeing. At least for me, reading a book is a personal experience. These are just my personal thoughts. But I am gonna side-eye some of the queer representation in their books. I don't mind a stereotype being used or engaged with as long as you're saying something about it. But I didn't feel that this book said anything at all. It's delusional belief that it's disturbing and hardcore when it's actually just very goofy and over the top. Just left a bad taste in my mouth. I will note that I have only read the first novella, which is the first half of this collection. Things have gotten worse since we last spoke, and other misfortunes. And I'm hoping the other two stories are not going to be as misfortunate as this one. I have been on the fence about whether I'm even going to read the next two stories, because frankly, at this point, 1 out of 4 is not a very good batting average for Eric LaRocca. I'm just gonna say they're not for me at this point. I don't think I'm gonna be buying any more of their books. I might finish this one. Things have gotten worse since we last spoke, a misfortune indeed. And I wanted to end today by talking about what is perhaps my new favorite book and the most impactful piece of queer horror that I have ever read. I speak, of course, of Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright, now of course going by Billy Martin since his transition. This is one that I have sort of saved for a long time, and I'm glad I did, because wow, did this leave an impact on me. Exquisite Corpse was written in 1996, a very dangerous time for gay men. We generally think of the AIDS epidemic as taking place in the 80s, but at this time in the 90s, we still didn't know very much about HIV, and the people in charge in the United States just didn't care enough about this group of people to try to save them. And many, many lives were lost because of government ignorance and public derision, and the smug satisfaction that nature was giving these deviants the punishment that they deserved. And that is front and center in Exquisite Corpse. Many people place this as one of the most disturbing works of fiction ever written, and I'm inclined to agree, though I think a lot of people when they say that are thinking of the more typical splatterpunk and extreme sensibilities of the book. You know, people being flayed, necrophilia, cannibalism, horrid murder and violence and bodily fluids abound. And those things are very disturbing, and the psychological portrait of these serial killers that's painted are certainly disturbing aspects of this book. but it's that sense of hopelessness and righteous anger at the world that these men have that really make it a heavy read. It forces you to spend time in the heads of people dying of AIDS in a time where there was no hope for them, having their lives cut short and seeing how it impacts their worldview. The fear of not knowing your status, as it's put so beautifully by one character, having your life marked by a little vial of blood once every 6 months, and it just takes a change of results on one of those vials to completely change the trajectory of your life. That's what's hard to read in this book for me personally. A lot of people complain about this book as being written as if it's, an edgy teenager, and I kind of get that, but it feels like one of the only books that has this sort of nihilistic, the world's out to get me, everything sucks, let's burn society type of books that kind of forces you to buy into it, because these people have been screwed over by circumstance, by their government, by the world around them, some of them by lovers, and some of them by family. And I think these people have every right to be as jaded and nihilistic towards the world as they are. One thing that's very important to note, though, is that this is from the 90s, and HIV is not the monster that it was when this book was written and the monster that it's portrayed as in this book. This is very accurate for the time, but I do find that the average person today is highly uneducated on the state of HIV, and I think a lot of people are very blind to the extent to which it's managed. Obviously, this book is not going to educate you on that stuff, and I think that that's sort of external homework that you should do if you aren't already aware of what words like undetectable and pre-exposure prophylaxis mean. A lot of the straight people that I talk to don't seem to know that you can be with someone who is HIV positive and have no risk of contracting the disease through sex. With all of that said, this definitely brought me to a place of anxiety that is rare for me in horror. It does follow two characters who are serial killers very closely based on real-life serial killers, and there is a lot of murder and gore and rape. Content warnings abound, but this is like the only extreme horror book that I would say most people should try to suffer through, because this gives you just such a window into the hopelessness, I think, of the gay community during this time, and also the resilience and the way these characters sort of take their destinies into their own hands. This is a book with gay people as monsters, but not all of them are, but they are all supremely damaged. It is a horror book through and through. This is a nasty little volume, and this to me is just the quintessential example of splatterpunk. It's not just extreme for extreme's sake, it is saying something, and something very important, and something that I think needs to be understood, especially today. I think it's important to remember what we've gone through as a community in the past, and how resilient we are. I don't know how much deeper I want to dig into this. I just thought it was so goddamn good. Beautifully written, splatterpunk, extreme horror. One of the only examples of that that also fits, I think, very neatly into the genre of transgressive literary fiction. It is a really grueling read, and I love it so, so much. I will be reading it again for sure, and it was the highlight of my Pride Month. Go figure, the book about AIDS, necrophilia, and cannibalism is the highlight of my Pride Month, but what else did you expect? If you have not yet read Exquisite Corpse or Tell Me I'm Worthless, I can't recommend them enough. Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke was not for me, but I know it's for a lot of people, and it's worth a try. That's gonna be it for this video. In spite of all the terrible things that we're having to deal with as a community right now, happy Pride. Go be the gayest version of yourself that there is. Go to a drag show and tip your local drag queens, and read Exquisite Corpse for mama. I'm Carmilla du Maurier, the composer next door, and I'll see ya in hell.